This is Jay Michaels, and here we are at Phoenix FearCon. That's phoenixfearcon.com. And that's not just Phoenix FearCon. This is Phoenix FearCon X, X410. This is the 10th anniversary of Phoenix FearCon. And that's why we have a multitude of guests, we have a multitude of events, we have a multitude of films here. And we're virtual as well as real. Last year, if you remember, we were exclusively virtual because of the fact we decided to have a plague in this world. And so we all were strapped to our computers joyously. We were still able to have FearCon, but online. This year, it's online and in person. Now, big thing that this online fervor has created is the concept of connecting people via podcast and via video podcast. And I am thrilled to have one of the leaders in that. We have Scott Bradley, that's S.A. Bradley, and it's Hellbent for Horror. That's your podcast?
Absolutely.
Really brilliant. I was listening to it, and podcasts are meant to be something you kind of listen to as you're doing something else. I couldn't do that, because as I'm doing something else, I'm like, wow, that's good. Wow.
I'm here to spoil your day, your schedule.
Scott, I got to give you credit. I listened to so many podcasts, and the thing that I really loved about yours in terms of you is you really love this subject. It's not just something that makes money. It's not something that you kind of do well. It's something you really care about. So what you ask your guests and what you say is really powerful stuff. Tell us about Hellbent. Tell us about your books. Tell us about you.
Of course. Well, thank you so much for that fine introduction. And I'm so glad to hear that it connects with you on that level, because what I really do, whether it be the books or whether it be the one-man show or it be the podcast, the long-running podcast at this point, it's always about starting a conversation. I want to have a conversation with people, and I want to have a conversation that brings out passion. Passion can be on anything. It just so happens that mine, the way that the life-saving energies came to me, was out of horror. And it's usually a thing that horror people don't usually think is going to be positive. And yet it was something that in a way kind of reinvigorated my life on several occasions. When I was a child in a very strange situation where I had a mother and father who were in basically a doomsday cult. And they thought the world was going to end in 1975. Highly Christian, very crazy. And I was just an 9-year-old kid. And the weird thing was they were also going through a divorce at the time, but they weren't telling me. And so my entire world as a child was falling apart, and I couldn't say anything about it. And it just so happened I stumbled upon a horror movie, and it galvanized me. It crushed me. I had nightmares for 3 days. And after that, I found a hunger for watching it again, a curiosity. And it's something that happened 2 other times in my life where horror kind of helped me, whether I could understand it or not, it helped me work out a real world issue. It gave me comfort in a way that something that was like, oh, you're going to be okay, wasn't going to do. And it's not for everybody, that kind of thing. But what I found was that, the real world troubles, I can't control at all, but I can control whether I hit pause, I put down the book, or if I can turn whatever monster there is, all monsters are metaphors, turn that into whatever is worrying me. And so what I found is the power of allegory, the power of metaphor in horror stories is what I really have been connected with. And I love to talk that passion with people, because I was in Silicon Valley for 10 years working in startups, and everything was great until it wasn't. For some reason, I just felt this emptiness. And I had felt this emptiness a couple times in my life, and I just was wondering what I could do to change things up. I realized I was speaking other people's passions for a decade, not my own. And where I was working, there was nobody who was into what I was into. And so it was almost like I had to suppress everything that I really loved to be really good at my job. Really good at my job was great, but I found this gaping hole. And then one day my wife said, I'm done with this. You must go do something fun. You like horror movies, right? There's a horror movie convention in Chicago, and it's the reuniting of people from Halloween, 1978, one of your favorites. Why don't you go? And normally I would say no. I hadn't been to a convention in decades because that just wasn't my scene. But I decided I'm going sight unseen. I don't know anybody. I'm going to go there. I don't care about seeing the stars. I want to get into conversations. I want to have late night conversations. Can I find my people? And so I spent a few days. The last day, that last night, I found a bunch of people in black t-shirts milling into a corner. They had moved all of the furniture in the foyer to a corner, and they were secretly talking. And I walked up, going, "You guys talking about horror movies?" And they sat me down and said, "Yeah, let's see what this kid's got." And before you know it, it's dawn, and I realize I am thoroughly energized. How do I share this? Because I think the big thing about fandom, it's just hoarding unless you share it. The real spirit that I get, the joy that I get, is that I talk to others about it and I share things. And the people that I would connect with when I go to horror movie conventions are the freaks, the people who are like, yes, I love the 1976 version of Alice, Sweet Alice. It's great. And they're like, what, that film? And before you know it, you go down this path, and it's almost like music. And what I find is that we are exercising anxieties of the regular world. We're connecting in a way that's great. And that's what I think horror does for folks like me, is that it gives you a tribe. It allows you to not take yourselves too seriously. It lets you maybe take a look at that shadow that's inside of everybody and allow you to have a safe handshake with it, a Jungian handshake. And then the other thing is a sense of play. Give us a sense of play. As adults, we lose the ability to play. And then we find that something in this, and even people who don't like horror, I think they secretly do. When I talk to people that don't like horror, well, let's put it this way. When I talk to people who love horror, we speak about for 20 minutes in line, and then if it's someone who doesn't like horror, we speak for about 20 minutes in line, because people have passion about this. It's not like saying, "Oh, I don't like Lifebuoy soap." It's more like, I need to tell you why I don't like this thing that gets under my skin. They have an opinion, and even giving that opinion is a release. And so Hellbent for Horror is made for people who are horror fans, but also people who think that horror is a certain thing that they dislike. Horror is a huge, wide genre. It's almost like Frank's Red Hot. It goes on any genre, and it works perfectly. You can sprinkle it on anything, and it takes it to a different level. You can take it to an area of metaphor and allegory that drama does not, it just isn't equipped to be able to do. Drama does what it does fantastically. But the idea of taking the thing that speaks to us on a primal level, horror is able to do that. And so my podcasts say, welcome. Come in. I understand you may not like horror. Let me tell you how it's done things in society that you may not understand or may not even notice. It's one of the most diverse storytelling styles that we have. It may be the oldest storytelling style. I think it's the second
Yes.
oldest storytelling. It's tailor-made, allegory, metaphor. It allows us to talk about uncomfortable subjects that we never want to watch in a drama, right? We wouldn't do that in a straight drama. It allows for that visceral exploration of what makes us human. And sometimes that's dirty and ugly. You're welcome to come in and say, I don't necessarily like this, but you know what you're talking about here with the concept of dread? I kind of like that. And, I never thought about how this can affect society and how society affects horror. I always say, if you want to find out what was really freaking people out in 1950, watch the really bad drive-in movies, not the big ones, not the ones that everybody knows. Watch the ones where they had to open up the newspaper and say, how are we going to get people excited in outrage to come see this movie? The ones that were in the 30s and 40s were about white slavery, or the white lab coach things with the idea of procreation being seen for the first time in movies. These were hot button subjects. We had Hostel, in the early 2000s, right around Abu Ghraib. I don't think that's a surprise. I don't think that's a shock. I don't think it's a coincidence. I
I've
think that
always said that. I have always said that. When you look at the 30s, it seems all the monsters, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, they all seem to come from Europe. Gee, what was
yeah,
happening in the 30s in Europe? And you're so right. The 50s was the Cold War. We didn't know what was going to land on our doorstep. So eventually it came from Mars or from under the sea or whatever.
right. Yeah. And it was always Pandora's box, right? So many of the monsters from the 50s were kind of an unconscious guilt, that we did what we did. I mean, we dropped 2 bombs. We saved a lot of people's lives, but we dropped 2 atom bombs on people. No one else in the world can say that except for us. And I think
Right.
that comes with a paranoia, and it comes with a grief. I mean, but look at Japan. Not 10 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they make Godzilla. And,
Right. Right.
and Godzilla does not attack the United States. It attacks them. And that's a very interesting thing. Comes from the sea, comes from nature. An ancient beast has been resurrected just to mess with you, just to fuck with your island. And I think that that is saying a lot about how two different groups of people looked, two cultures in the same war, looked at the end result of it. And I think that horror is the only, you could not get people to sit and talk about this kind of thing unless there was a Senate hearing, right?
Right.
But you can talk about it when it's the big giant coming out of the ocean, or the giant ant that for some reason is headed to Los Angeles in the sewer systems, you know?
Well, the whole notion of Godzilla is the fact that he breathes this nuclear fire
Yeah.
out of him. So of course you see the nightmare within the Japanese culture in creating Godzilla.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's fantastic because it's not too soon. Nobody screamed too soon for Godzilla.
Right.
And yet it was within a decade. And I think that that's a sobering thought. That there, like comedy, are there things that you can't talk about? With horror, are the things you can't talk about? I think you can talk about everything, but you best be ready for the wrath. The wrath will come depending upon what you speak of, and you may not be appreciated for what you've said for a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades, but at the same point you can speak to it. And I think it's one of the things that keep horror and comedy work on the element of surprise. They may not be the same, but they have some kissing cousin similarities.
It's the
Working on,
truth. It's
yeah,
it essentially is the truth, because what is laughter? Because things are funny, what you find funny, I might not, and vice versa. But laughter is just the cough, if you will, of truth. Ha ha ha! I didn't realize that's what
yes,
happened in the government. And you're right in terms of horror. I totally agree with you. We look at these monsters. This is the personification of what gives us nightmares.
yes,
We all love zombies because what is coming back to get us? What is the George Romero was considered brilliant because he Dawn of the Dead, when they were in the shopping mall, it was
yeah,
like returning people to their basest instincts. We see that in The Walking Dead as well. Each monster, each decade is us saying we're afraid of that now.
yeah.
Please, if we just watched, and I say this every person I speak to, if we just watched Idiocracy and Contagion a little bit closer.
Yes, yes. Oh my goodness. And just read a book. Reading a book would have been good.
Thank
Watch a
you,
National Geographic special. You
thank
may
you.
have been able to, but that's that's part of the horror. We're going to be dealing with this for a while. I know that I told people I didn't expect to be living in the Decameron 2020, but here we are,
Yeah.
and we're in this thing where we're going to be haunted by this for a while. But I think it's going to be one of those things where you're not going to be able to go at it directly. Like there are some movies that have tried to go right at the pandemic, and even books by big authors that I love. I couldn't get through them. I'm fatigued by it, but I'm not fatigued, on the other hand, of how we changed. What we did is what's interesting, and that's
Yeah.
going to be the horror stories that are going to really speak to us. Don't worry about the monster. Worry about the monster within that comes out with just a little bit of a push on that infrastructure that we've got, and it's
If you
been
look at
scary.
Nosferatu, for instance, that was done about
Mm.
2 years after the 1918 pandemic. That was
Yes.
1922, but it was probably filmed the year before or whatever. And there's one section where they realize that the vampire is loose in their town. And what do? Everyone stays indoors. Everyone
Yeah.
wears a mask, and they're calling the vampire a plague. So
Yeah.
so right there, we're watching this personification. We don't know it for decades until we have our own plague. But yes, every creature is the creature of our imagination.
Yeah.
We just latch on to the one that scares us the most.
Yeah, what an awesome example. I love when people bring up movies from that time period, because I think uh, that horror film and Caligari, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, are so important in taking German expressionism, which I think is the godfather of where modern horror, even any horror, Gothic horror to modern horror, gets its strength. You
Fully.
have the Gothic nature, sure, but what I think is great is you have this expressionism, which is taking the internal angst that you've got, or whatever emotion that you have, and having it be a literal pastiche on the film,
Yeah.
something that you're literally walking through. I mean, Caligari, you're walking through these twisted buildings and everything, because the town, I mean, they're in the middle of surviving all the reparations of World War I. They're
Right.
starving, they're insane, so the world is insane, the world is twisted. I see big similarities between that and the new Joker film, because there is this thing of these are not real worlds. These are horror movie cities where nothing works. You can only see the insane way. And that's something that horror has magically created out of what happened in German Expressionism. It's all about emotion. Horror is the only genre named after an emotion. So it's there to deal with the internal, the thing that we can't really articulate. You know, I can speak to you now about what I think the pandemic's about and what's going to be important. Rewind or fast forward 10 years and see how wrong I was, because I can't see the forest for the trees. It's
Right.
going to become very apparent at some point what this was all about. And I love that horror is able to kind of pinpoint that unconsciously. I think horror gets it right most of the time. I love what Tobe Hooper, the late Tobe Hooper, said about movies like Chainsaw, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And he said, you know, sometimes you make a movie like this and it takes 20 years to figure out what it's about, what it's really
Right,
about.
right. And even
And
then, that changes constantly. You mentioned the Joker. The character, was created from a Conrad Veidt film called The Man
yes,
Who Laughs.
yes,
And that was about a disease. That was about a disease that contorted this man's face. And you bring up the German Expressionism. The films of the 20s were not monsters. You know, Quasimodo, The Phantom of the Opera, Cesare in Caligari, and even, well, Nosferatu, I guess is the exception, but these were physical or mental deformity. And
yeah,
so that was our terror then. But you're right, we shoot now to the Joker. And again, it's a mental deformity. He
yeah.
laughs because he has a mental illness. He has a syndrome in him. And you're right, the Batman, it's a story of Batman, but the Waynes are pricks. They're
Yep.
wealthy,
Way in
they're
the
wealthy
background,
bastards.
assholes. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And you're right, crime-ridden, nasty, awful things where people honor the anti-hero. I won't call them the villain. I'll say the
Yeah.
anti-hero. So yeah, you're right. We've seen a simple comic book character really run the gamut of everything we've considered terrifying throughout the last almost 100 years.
Yeah, the Joker's an amazing, I think, an updating of old Scratch. You know, this idea of the devil, a
Yes.
version of Lucifer, where he's always anarchy, you know, or he's Loki, if you want to call him Loki. But if you look at what the Joker's always stood for, even when he was just a total villain, he was always about upsetting the apple cart, which is what horror does magnificently. It's there to upset the apple cart. And George Romero's the first guy who doesn't put all the apples back. You know, he's the
Right.
guy who lets you sit there in your stuff. But the Joker, if you look at it from Bob Kane on, he's changing constantly with the times, but he's always about anarchy. And this last version is the most anarchic and the most disturbing, as far as I'm concerned. It's Travis Bickle, who doesn't look in the mirror and let us know that he's insane. We root for him in a weird way. I'm interested in how, when I went to see Joker, people who were younger saw him in a more heroic light than people who are older, who are like saying, you know, it's weird because he's blaming everybody else. You know, normally this movie doesn't blame everybody else. It's, oh, this guy's sick mentally, and they just leave it at that. But the Joker in the end tries to persuade you that everything is wrong, and you get Jokers when everything is wrong. You can't, it's not their fault, it's your fault. And that was really incendiary when I saw it in the theaters. I was like, wow, I felt really uncomfortable. I felt like I did when I first saw Get Out. I was invigorated, but at the same time, also, I felt uncomfortable, as I should have, because that movie's really about the idea of when your allies are no longer your allies. Your allies have sold you down the river. You're a mouthpiece. They want you quiet, you know. And I was like, boy, that's really interesting. That when I see it, it becomes so plain. But that's what the Waynes are, right? The
Oh,
Waynes
completely.
are, yeah, they're supposed to be there for the protection. They're the big heroes, and they're completely bloated and distant. They live in a house in the hill, and they don't care about how people are just killing each other in town. And I think there's a huge similarity of the idea of being silenced. And you have this guy who can't stop laughing, right? You got this craziness. I love it.
It's interesting because the Jack Nicholson Joker had this one line in it where he says, you made me. And then
Yep.
Batman says, well, you made me. And then he makes a joke. Oh, look at this. We made each other. And Joaquin
Smart.
Phoenix takes it all the way. His blame, his
Yep.
screaming. He's saying, look, I'm a sick man, and look at what you have pushed me to. So he has taken that one comic line
Yeah.
and sent it to this terrifying future. It, as I'm talking to you, it's very funny. Joaquin Phoenix and Robert De Niro, who is in the movie, you might say they're in the same genre of film. They're in that
Yeah.
tough, hard-bitten thing. And Robert De Niro plays a talk show host that is
Yeah.
he's probably killed by the Joker. And it's so funny because there you have another allegory, if you will, where one generation is killing another, because the notion of the talk show, that's Johnny Carson, that's
Yep.
that's barely my generation. So it's one generation is killing another, and when you're saying Get Out, yes, it's the same thing. It's this lie. And if you're talking about the Waynes, they're supposed to be benevolent. No, they're not. They're draining us dry, claiming to be benevolent.
Yes.
And we see that in Get Out. Their friendliness, if you will, to the African American characters is not. It's they're draining them again. So
Yep.
I laugh because so many times when a horror movie is effective, people stop calling it a horror movie.
Yes.
They don't want to give it that title. They want to say it's a drama or something like that.
Yeah.
The Shape of Water. I didn't watch I didn't watch The Shape of Water when it first came out, because I thought, okay, well, I'll watch it. Academy Award. That's nice. Okay, I'll see it at some point. Then when I watched it, I said, oh my God, it's the creature from the Black Lagoon, but he gets the girl.
Yes.
And I realized, no, they can't call it a horror movie. It won an Academy Award.
Right. And it's like, that's one of my great pet peeves. And I actually have a one-man show called My Horror Manifesto, which is basically all about how horror does not deserve your shame. And it goes down from the very beginning, how, I mean, if you look at when The Exorcist came out, first movie that was a horror movie outside of like King Kong, that was nominated for Best Picture. And the very person who created it, William Friedkin, comes out and says, it's not a horror movie. It's like, how can you say it's not a horror movie? Jaws, they said, well, it's an adventure film. And
Right.
If you look at 1990, February 14th, Valentine's Day, when Silence of the Lambs came out, they were calling it one of the best horror movies ever made. What a great revolutionary horror film. When those gold statues started to appear, it was a psychological thriller. We got saddled with psychological thrillers for a decade, which made the 90s just this milquetoast, lukewarm, let's call everything a serial killer movie, that took away so much of the underpinning of what makes horror so interesting. And it was all about one thing. And it bothered me a lot. So I started talking about how, I grew up at a time when The Exorcist was in the theaters, as well as The Godfather. And so when I was there as a kid, I grew up on, the Andrew Sarrises and the Pauline Kaels that said, film will save us. Film means more. It's a revolution that's happening. Tours are happening, and any story means so much to us. And I bought into it. I was like, well, why can't it be horror? And like, no, it can't be horror. And I found that to be a terrible injustice all my life, sitting there saying, so many of these movies are so effective. So many people love them, but then they'll start calling them something else. It's like somebody stumbling upon your softcore porn collection. It's like, well, I only watched that for certain, I'll talk to cineasts who will tell me about the Umbrellas of Cherbourg. We can talk about that forever. We can talk about, Pasolini, and they'll be like really into it. And then I'll also say something about a horror film. Like my first horror film that I remember really getting freaked out about, the one that was big for my parents during divorce, was I stumbled upon HBO showing Don't Look Now. That opening 10 minutes nearly killed me. And that's very esoteric. It's a very artsy horror film, but it's a horror film. And I have so many people who tell me it's not, and people who love it. And I'm like, why are you doing this to yourself? It's not porn. It's okay. And even if it's porn, well, who am I to judge? There's something there for somebody. But this is actually a great art, as far as I'm concerned. It gets to be artful when you're in a horror film. Yes, there are terrible horror films, but you don't stop having dramas because of Jiggly and fucking Bonfire of the Vanities. People aren't getting rid of the idea of dramas because of it. It's the idea that we are somehow considered redheaded stepchildren. And I really hate the renaming. The label system is a velvet rope. Let go of the velvet rope. And one of the reasons that I hate it is because if you change the labeling or the genre every time there is a horror movie that reaches the level of poetry, then there are never any horror movies that reach poetry, because you take them all and you move them away. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You keep it in the basement. You force it to be certain things. And horror is far too robust. Has worked far too hard ever since Caligari to create things. There have always been artists that have worked in there that have somehow helped us get through whatever madness we were in. Invasion of the Body Snatchers changed cinema, and it changed what we could talk about. All of that happens under the guise, and you'll have people go, well, even Frankenstein is a science fiction thing. I'm like, no. I mean, you can say it's a science fiction brand. There is science fiction and horror that works together. Alien is science fiction horror. The Thing is science fiction horror. But what does it want you to feel is the thing. If I'm looking at what a horror movie is, what the definition is, I say it's the definition that's in a dictionary, which is basically giving you the sense of dread, horror, disgust, terror. So a horror movie or a horror story is one that invokes that upon you. And that opens it up a lot. It's not just about buckets of blood, although it can be. But to me, the idea is that you don't only ask that question of what is a horror movie and you give that definition. There's a secondary question, which is the why. Why, out of all the different ways that a filmmaker could tell a story, it's not like this is brand new technology. Why did they decide to use the tropes of horror? Why did they use the pacing of horror, the lighting of horror, the setup of horror, if they don't want you scared? And in the end, what do they leave you with to go home with? Bambi, has 2 scares in it, but it's not a horror cartoon, because at the end, it's really there to enlighten you and uplift you and make you feel very strongly about family. But if you're coming home from a movie and it makes you feel a darkness, or it brings a darkness with you, I think that's a guarantee that it's a horror film. And
the irony is Shakespeare.
yeah.
If Shakespeare was around today, he'd be writing Lifetime original movies, he'd be writing porn,
Yep.
and he'd be writing horror movies.
Absolutely.
But because we honor Shakespeare, suddenly the story of a bloodthirsty commando who enforces the powers of darkness to become king and decided to call it Macbeth is a classic and not a horror film.
Yeah.
You hit 2 things, which is very interesting. I remember when I was a kid. Do you remember the TV Guide?
Oh, yes.
In the good old days, they never called it horror. They would put, Channel 2 movie - thriller, because they couldn't say horror. And you mentioned something else which made me laugh. In the 1950s, Hammer Films got X ratings. They would rather call them porn than call them horror movies.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really interesting.
It's also, it says something about where we were at a certain point and how much, say, George Romero changes things. Because when you could call it horror was if you had horror hosts, right? The midnight guys that would show all the shock theater films from Universal, and they'd show the crappiest things, and the guy would be wearing, Count Floyd, Dracula gear and stuff. My guy wore a fez. He was Uncle Ted in Uncle Ted's Ghoul School. But that you could call horror. And horror was basically relegated, that is, to children's stuff back when Night of the Living Dead came out. Horror movies traditionally played Saturday afternoon, Saturday morning. Parents would drive and leave their kids off to watch the double feature. That would be, something with Vincent Price. And the first time that Night of the Living Dead showed, it showed at that time period, and Roger Ebert was there. Part of the legend of what happens with Night of the Living Dead is he writes a scathing review going, who made this terrible thing? There are children walking out as if they've been in Vietnam. They're like carrying each other. And he said this whole thing about there was flesh eating, there was nudity. What is happening to cinema? And I'm listening to this and I'm going, you're the guy who's talking about like Godard and stuff. You've got to be kidding me that you don't get this. And you also end up being a huge Russ Meyer guy, even write a screenplay for Russ Meyer. So come on, tell me you're not in the gutter a little bit, Roger. So it was
because it was called a horror movie,
right?
If it had French subtitles and was called De Note de Meurtre or Morte,
right?
Then he'd say it was a work of genius.
Yeah, and they later do. Because something about horror that I think is great is that it does push past all of those boundaries. It finds its way. After all of this time, not only do we have Shape of Water as a horror film. But the next year, Parasite is really a horror movie.
Right,
You look at
right.
that, that is a horror film. And you had a couple movies. 1917 is not shot like a war film. What is that supposed to be giving you? You have this running, literally a running commentary through an area where you're like in a single player action game where
Right,
you're
right.
basically, you only see in one direction. You see in whatever direction that person's going. You never get to see around corners. He's going in shadows and flame. I say so much of that movie 1917, it is not there to give you much more than the shock that horror, that war is horrible, and it is a horror story. And so to me, it's a horror film. You know, it's
That last sequence in the movie where he is running finally to deliver his
yeah,
message, explosions all around him. I couldn't breathe when I saw that
yeah,
sequence. I never thought of it. Yes, that is a horror movie
yeah.
also.
And the answer is so horrifying. It could be not a horror movie, like the end of Saving Private Ryan stops that from being a horror movie. There's a lot of patriotism that comes out. There's a resolution with the generations that happens. That movie wants to heal. I don't think Full Metal Jacket wanted to heal. I think that's a horror film. But then 1917, just when he goes through all of this, it could be a moment where we have resolution, we feel an honor. Instead, the general goes, "Oh yeah, thank you. You know how many times we've had a guy just like you say this? You know, you're just, we're going to die anyway, right?
Yeah,
I got this last week too. And you know what we did? We moved forward. And you know what we're going to do? We're going to move forward. So everything that you saw was for nothing. You know, this was that's the dark vision that is there in 1917, and why there's so much that you can write about World War One, and probably why not much is written about World War One, because it is a horrifying thing that ends with a plague. For God's sake, it can't get much worse. I mean, you
yeah,
go through all of this, and what does this attempt to unify everyone against a common enemy? We get another common enemy that doesn't care about sides, and it just decimates a quarter of the population at the time got sick in 1918. I forget how many died, but a quarter of the entire population of the world got sick with the
yeah.
Spanish flu. So it's it's and yet we can talk about this stuff and still have fun with horror films. And the horror film isn't going to beat us over the head. But I love watching Night of the Living Dead to this day. It gets shown a lot because it's public domain, right? So you'll have people at Halloween show it, and I love sitting in an audience and hearing people giggling in the beginning. It's black and white. The acting's a little hokey. They're in a graveyard. It's broad daylight, obviously, but that's the scary thing. Suddenly, this guy comes and attacks them. And they might be a little bit shocked by that, but once you get in the barn, once they're in the farmhouse and they start locking themselves in, you can feel the movie getting smaller and closer, and everyone goes quiet. This 50, 60-year-old film, everybody's breathless by the end of
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
And when that end happens, it just goes to show how much more we need to grow and how much things haven't changed, but also just how powerful that ending is. When that ending happens, there's a gasp every time.
oh,
And
completely.
I go, wow, this movie never, this movie changed things. It matters. And God bless George Romero. It's a shame that he and everybody else really didn't get the honor that they should have gotten for what they did. And I think a lot of it is because it's just this independent guy from Pittsburgh making scary movies. Who cares?
It says a lot. When he made the movie, he used a particular town there, and he turned to everyone in the town. He said, if you let us film in front of your store, if you give us guts for us to use in this sequence, you
Yeah,
could be a zombie in
yeah,
it. And everyone ran to do it. You'd think if it
yeah.
was so repellent, they'd say, we want nothing to do with your film. Everyone was begging to be a zombie, and that
Oh,
certainly
yeah.
hasn't changed.
By Day of the Dead, by the time he's doing Day of the Dead in Florida, film critics are flying down there saying, "Can I be a zombie?" And he was paying everybody $1, right? And he's like, "Sure, you can be in here." And I mean, even Roy Frumkes, who was in charge of School of Visual Arts, he made a documentary called "Document of the Dead" at the Monroeville Mall while they were shooting Dawn of the Dead. And
Oh,
he's actually a zombie in the movie, and
oh, that's great.
he's the guy who gets hit in the face with a pie, and so you have these folks who get it, right? And they'll come to the aid of it. Is it not Jay Hoberman? Jason Zinnemann is the modern film critic that gets it and is always asking the question that I ask: why can't you say horror? Why is horror so repellent to say? Just say horror. It is horror. It's
Yeah.
okay. And I think a lot of it comes down to we some people believe that there are good and bad emotions. I don't think there are. I think we need to feel them all. It depends on what you do with them. If you spend all day in one bad emotion or a dark emotion, that's an issue. But people are repellent from what horror makes them think of, and to me, that's healthy. It's in us. We are animal. We don't have to act on these things. I like to say that, comedy lets me laugh at things I'm not supposed to laugh at, and I get to see things that I would want to do that I won't do. And horror allows me to experience things I never ever want to experience, so that I can somehow get to the other side of that and make some catharsis, whatever that catharsis might be. And I think that catharsis is very, very personal. I also think it's like music. You know, when you're listening to music, I always talk about A Hard Day's Night, right? You have that jung in the beginning. That is anticipation. That is the beginning of something. That's a conversation ready to happen.
Yeah.
And to me, you can be changed. Your point of view or your energy for a day, how you're feeling can change with one note, one chord. And I think the same thing happens with horror films. One image can change how you feel. Your energy can change immediately. And that's because neither of them are intellectual. Music's not intellectual. You're not listening to it the first time and going, oh, yes, I understand what's happening here. And he's talking about, I love the lyrics of this. No, you're experiencing it on a visceral level, goes right past here, goes in the tummy, goes into the heart, and you're sitting there experiencing what music does to you. It's magic. It's true alchemy. And then you have horror, and that does the same thing. It bypasses here to get to the inarticulate area of our body where I can't tell you why I feel bad. I don't know. I don't know what the emotion is. I can just go, bleh. And horror can actually hit that and soothe that and give me a thing of like, yes, it's seen, and somehow I feel relaxed.
It's interesting you talk about Hard Day's Night, that one note. I don't think there are emotions. I think there is one emotion. It's our interpretation of it. Someone might be terribly sad at something, but someone else is going to be terribly glad at it. There's the story of Steven Spielberg whenever he directs any of his films, and his films could be horror movies, could science fiction, etc. But he is known to laugh when something works. They talked about it in Jurassic Park, when the dinosaur, when the mechanical creature finally appears, and when he saw the CGI, he laughed uproariously. Here's this shocking moment, but he found it funny. It's like horror touches us. And allows us to incorporate all of these things. We might laugh at a beheading in a movie, we might not. It just touches us. Now you've written books, you have your podcast, one man show. What is your material about? What's your mission in terms of your own work?
Oh, that's a great question. It really is starting that conversation, but it's really trying to make a love letter to other people and to horror itself, about those things that go bump in the night, and how horror not only reinvents itself, but it also reflects each generation's anxieties. And I think that it is healing as well as thrilling. I think it allows us to have that sense of play. It allows us to really examine parts of ourselves that we normally wouldn't if we didn't have a good strong reason, and allows us to just I think enjoy parts of life that sometimes are uncomfortable, sometimes for nothing more than the idea that we can get through it. And the idea that there is beauty, I call it horrible beautiful. My book is called Screaming for Pleasure, How Horror Makes You Happy and Healthy. And it is that love letter. And it talks about, it's not quite a journey through horror through my life, but there are anecdotes. I didn't want to be confessional, but at the same point, I wanted to say, here's why these things affect me and why I think it matters, and this is what happens in the world as we see it. But I believe in horrible beautiful, and horrible beautiful is like the sense of awe that we have. You can look at something that is terrifying, and you can't look away. And it's not like you are screaming while that's happening. You just kind of absorb it. You just kind of disappear. There's a great moment of horrible, beautiful enacted in Alien, which happens with Harry Dean Stanton. He's chasing after a kitty cat, right? He's chasing after Jonesy. And this is the first time we get to see the full xenomorph as an adult, I guess. And we have this thing rising behind Harry Dean Stanton's character, and the cat is backing up. And Harry turns around, and he doesn't go, ah! He just looks and goes, he is seeing, as far as he's concerned, a god. He's seeing the devil. He's seeing death. He's seeing the monster. He's seeing every mistake he's ever made in life, whatever it is. And he is just gone into awe. And I think that's the highest form that horror can go to. And that is horrible, beautiful, where the xenomorph is beautiful. It's also obscene. It's also amazing. And at the same point, you can't help but look at it. And I think that that's the kind of thing that I like to talk to is you have the opportunity to find and embrace parts of life that you may reject because you think that they're ugly, and you can find beauty in them. If you can find beauty in something like that, maybe you can find beauty in yourself, which I think if you find beauty inside of yourself and you're able to have that handshake with a part of you that may not be great, but it's human, maybe you'll do that for someone else too.
That's great. Horrible, beautiful. I'm going to remember that because I think that encompasses it all. Where can we find your stuff? Tell us how we get to your podcast. Tell us how we can get your books. Tell us about where can we find you? Where can we find all your material?
Well, fantastic. First off, I'm going to be at Phoenix FearCon October 15th to 16th. And I am going to be speaking to people. As I mentioned, my first time going to a convention in years, I went there as a civilian and just wanted to talk. And that's what I'm going to do here. I want to talk to people who are passionate about horror. I don't care who you are. We're going to be doing a podcast. I'm probably going to ask you my patented question, which is, what is your first kiss with horror? Which isn't your favorite horror film, but the one that got you down this road to ruin, the thing that you could not shake. It might have made you unhappy like your first kiss. I don't know what your first kiss was like, but I hit teeth, right? And so it wasn't fantastic. But at the same point, I wanted it again, right? I was like, this is interesting and it's exotic. And so I want to ask people what their first kiss with horror is, and then go from there. Find out what it is that makes you so excited. What about horror is so great? What happened in your life? Let's talk about that, because I think that that's what puts us all together. I look for community. I look for lack of a better term, tribe. I look for the people who are like me. And what I find with horror folk and why I love to talk to them is that they are super passionate, because a lot of times you can't talk about this. So when you are in the realm of people who wish to talk to you, you will go on and let your passion fly, let your freak flag fly. And I think that that's kind of important. I think that that is helpful. Most of us that are in horror, I won't say that everybody, but I will say that a lot of us had hard times as children. We had a bad first act, maybe. The second act is rocking, though. We found ourselves, and now we're having this great time. And I think that I find that horror fans are some of the happiest, funniest people, because they let go. They have to let go to be able to do this. But if you're not able to see me there, there are a couple other cons. You can find that stuff written on my website, but you can find just about everything at hellbentforhorror.com. You will be able to find my podcast. I'm about to put out my 100th episode, and that's the number 100. I've had a couple side episodes and things, but I don't care. I'm not big on labels. I like the idea of having this 100 though, because people have been asking for it. And it's really all about passion. It's all about fandom and why I did what I did, which is kind of crazy. So hellbentforhorror.com, you can find it there. Screaming for Pleasure, How Horror Makes You Happy and Healthy is my book. You can find it on any bookseller that you want. I'm very grateful that it's where it is in Amazon. But if you are someone who loves to help the indies out, which is what I'm really all about, I have my ISBN number, the ISBN number, on my website there. There's a site that says books. If you go there, I have all my recommendations of books that I love, but I also have my book in there. And in there is my ISBN number. You put that down. You have a mom and pop store somewhere that needs help, they will be more than glad to buy that book for you. They will order it for you, and then you can get it through them. I really believe that why horror matters as well is that it is grassroots. There are a lot of big horror movies in Hollywood, but really they get all of their lifeblood from the indies, the people who are out there, the barnstormers. And so I look at hail the indie person. So if you have a bookstore like that, do that. And if you're looking for my my show, my one-man show, I don't have it. I've been doing it at universities of recent, which is really great. Webster University in St. Louis had me. The College of Idaho had me. I am going to be doing that in the next year. We're in negotiations to do a couple more live shows, but you may find it, a portion of it, perhaps here at Phoenix FearCon. I believe I may have had a little bit of it shown last year virtually. So I do have a virtual version, and perhaps you might be able to see it there. But anytime you want to find out anything about me, get involved in the newsletter on my website. And if you are in anywhere near Phoenix, Arizona, find yourself here during the times of October 15th and 16th. See what you want to see, absorb what you want to absorb, but give a little bit back. Come on in, talk horror, get around the campfire. That's what we do.
That's great. I'm definitely going to be, well, I'm obviously I'm going to be there, but I can't wait to speak to you further there, because you're quite brilliant in your philosophies on this. It's funny when you talk about the first kiss of horror. My first horror film was The Mummy's Hand, but I wouldn't say that was, I wouldn't say that I watched that on a dare and it terrified me, but that's another story. But The Horrible Beautiful was Hammer Films, was Horror of Dracula. Just to see the eloquence of Peter Cushing, the savagery of Christopher Lee in these colors, I was like, oh my God, this is real, but this is not real. This is sexual, but it's not. It's Victorian. It's.
I just got chills. I just got chills because I just remembered that intro when Christopher Lee gives that snarl and his eyes are red, and it's like, holy cow, that was a shot heard around the world. That was one of those things. We had the color version. And it's funny that you mentioned Mummy's Hand, because like mine, I say, is Don't Look Now. That was mine. And I like to make a difference between the first kiss and even Horrible Beautiful. There is something that I call court-appointed horror. And that is, my parents knew that I was scared to death of horror movies, but I wanted to watch them. So there were movies that I would watch that my dad said were okay for me. So I saw The Thing, the original Thing from Another Planet or Another World. I got to see them and Tarantula, but those were my dad's horror movies. They were already approved for me, right? The thing that I needed, my first kiss, is the illicit one. It's the one that sneaks around the gate. It's the one that gets me, right? And it's mine, and I own it, whether it hurts me or not, which is like every other quest that you are going to do. Joseph Campbell will tell you, you got to go in, you got to lose the dog while you're in the woods. And quite honestly, horror is not, that's its purpose. I understand if it offends some people, but that is its purpose. You know, that's what it exists for. Horror is not here to share half of its sandwich at recess. It is there for you to come into the woods. It is your quest, and you come to it, and you learn a little bit about yourself when you're standing in front of that oracle. And I think that's what it does. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Well, I'm going to chew your ear off when we're at FearCon together, but right now I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much. I gauge every interview I have by, if I walked away, did I learn something? And this was a master class. So thank you so much. It's a pleasure speaking to you. I can't wait to chat with you further at the event and be part of your podcast then as well. Looking forward to seeing you, and thank you so much for doing this today. It's a great and sincere pleasure. Thank you so much, and I can't wait to be at the convention. Very cool. See you then.